The prairie in late summer smelled of dust and dry sage, and something faintly metallic, as though the heat itself had a taste. The creek had shrunk to a dark line between cracked banks. Grasshoppers ticked in the brown grass like a clock no one had wound. On the south-facing slope, above an unfinished cabin, a figure stood waist-deep in a trench that ran the length of the hillside, swinging a mattock into red clay. The figure was thin, arms streaked brown to the shoulders, dress torn at the hem, boots caked heavy enough to double their weight. Behind the cabin, 24 salvaged window frames leaned against the wall in the sun, their glass catching the light and throwing it back in sharp lines that no one had come to explain. The freight driver set the crate on the dirt beside the unfinished cabin and would not look at Elva when he told her. Amos Mercer's wagon had overturned hauling stone near Fort Robinson. A wheel had broken on a washout, the load had shifted, and the wagon had rolled down a bank with Amos pinned beneath it. The Army post surgeon said the injuries were not survivable. The driver placed a blood-stiff glove and a cracked pocket watch on top of the crate and climbed back onto his seat before Elva could form a question. He left the way men leave when they have carried bad news too far and want distance from the face that receives it. She was 21 years old, standing 14 miles northwest of Chadron, Nebraska, in May of 1886, and the man who had filed the claim beneath her feet was dead. The claim was not proved. The cabin was not finished. Its north wall stopped 3 logs short of the roof line, and tarred paper flapped where chinking should have sealed the gaps. A strip of canvas nailed over the door served as the only barrier between the single room and whatever the wind carried. Inside sat 108 pounds of cornmeal in 2 sacks, 42 pounds of beans in a third, 24 pounds of salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth and hanging from a rafter nail, 70 pounds of potatoes that included next year's seed stock, and 18 pounds of dried apples in a flour barrel. Less than 1 cord of cut wood leaned against the east wall. Split logs stacked barely higher than Elva's waist. She had $19.60 folded inside her mother's Bible, a mule named Jack under a $32 chattel note due December 1st, a shovel, a mattock, a crosscut saw, a level vial, and 2 rolls of tarred paper her father had not lived to use. She could not leave. Leaving meant surrendering the only property Amos Mercer had ever owned. It meant allowing Clement Voss, the merchant who held the mule note and had already offered $25 for the claim and its south-facing spring, to profit from her father's death. She had no surviving close relatives, no money for eastbound fare, and no trade that would feed her in Chadron. The claim was everything. The claim was not enough. 5 months separated her from dependable spring food. Her stored provisions added up to roughly the minimum calories required for one adult through winter, but only if nothing spoiled, if no traveler needed feeding, and if she ate her seed potatoes, the same potatoes that were supposed to become next year's crop. The arithmetic allowed no margin. Every pound she consumed was a pound she could not plant. Every day she ate was a day closer to the bottom of the barrel. Rufus Bellamy arrived on the 4th day. He was 61, the owner of the nearest sawmill and the road overseer for the district. He had survived 20 Plains winters, buried a wife and a son on this same stretch of prairie, and considered himself qualified to judge any homestead within riding distance. He had known Amos Mercer, and he believed he knew what Amos's death meant for the daughter who remained. Bellamy did not knock. He tied his horse to the cabin's corner post and walked the perimeter slowly, testing every joint with his boot or his hand. He kicked the base log on the north wall and watched it give half an inch. He tugged a sheet of tarred paper until it tore free in a long strip. He crouched beside the woodpile and counted the rows with one finger, his lips moving. He entered without invitation. Inside, he stood in the center of the room and turned a full circle. His eyes moved from the cornmeal sacks to the bean bag, to the salt pork on its nail, to the potato pile, to the dried apples. He opened the stove door and looked at the ash inside. He checked the cabin's one window, a single sash frame with a cracked pane, and pressed his thumb against the putty. It crumbled. 3 sacks of meal, he said. A bag of beans. That pork will not last you past August if you eat a reasonable portion. He straightened from the firewood. 12 days of stove wood, maybe 14 if you burn small and go cold at night. Elva stood near the doorway with her arms crossed. She had not asked for the inspection. Your north wall is 3 logs short. The chinking that exists is half mud and half air. That tarred paper is the only thing between you and the wind, and I just tore a piece of it off with 2 fingers. Bellamy pulled a splinter from the door frame and examined it. The roof will leak before September. The floor is bare dirt, which means your stores are sitting on ground that will freeze solid by November and sweat moisture every time the stove runs. I know what the cabin looks like, Elva said. Then you know what you're facing. He set the splinter on the sill. You need at least 6 cords of wood for a winter. Properly chinked walls. A root cellar dug below the frost line. Enough preserved produce. Dried corn, salted meat, pickled vegetables, to see April. Your father was a strong man with 2 good hands, and he had not finished any of those things by the time he died. I know what he had not finished. Bellamy removed his hat and rubbed the band. Sweat had darkened the leather. He looked at Elva the way men looked at a horse with a broken leg, with pity that was already calculating the cost of mercy. I can place you as a domestic in Chadron. The hotel needs kitchen help. You would have a roof, meals, and enough wages to settle the mule note by spring. And the claim? You would forfeit the claim, or sell it. Voss offered $25 for it, for the hill in the spring, $25 for 160 acres my father broke his back to hold. Voss is a scoundrel, Bellamy said, but he is not wrong that the land is worth more than what is sitting on it. A woman alone with 1 mule and $19 cannot build what your father could not build with 2 good hands and a full summer ahead of him. He replaced his hat and walked to the door. He paused with one hand on the canvas flap. I have buried people who were more prepared than you are, he said. I do not want to bury another one. He left without waiting for a reply, and Elva listened to his horse until the hoofbeats dissolved into the grass, and the only sound left was the canvas lifting and falling in the wind. She sat on the cabin floor that evening and opened the level vial her father had carried from Iowa. The bubble drifted left, then settled. She set it on the sill and watched it hold steady while the wind found every gap in the north wall and reminded her, in the language of cold air and creaking logs, that Bellamy had not said a single thing that was untrue. June arrived with heat that pressed the sky flat against the prairie. The creek that crossed the northwest corner of the claim shrank to a dark thread between cracked banks. Elva scratched a garden plot into the south-facing hillside and planted beans, squash seed, and a row of radishes. The beans came up pale and curled within a week. Grasshoppers found them before the leaves could toughen. She picked the insects off by hand, crushing them between her fingers until the smell turned her stomach, but they returned faster than she could kill them. She replanted. The second planting germinated, pushed 2 sets of leaves into the light, and then wilted when 3 consecutive days passed without rain, and the topsoil turned to powder beneath her fingers. She watered from the creek, hauling bucket after bucket up the slope, but the water vanished into the ground as fast as she could pour it, and the leaves went from wilted to brown to paper in the space of an afternoon. Jack the mule lost weight steadily. His ribs showed through the hide like the slats of a broken crate, and his hip bones stood out sharp enough to hang a hat on. Elva cut her own meals to twice a day, cornmeal mush at dawn, and a small portion of beans with salt pork at dusk, and gave the animal the better feed because without him she could not haul timber, could not drag stone, could not move anything heavier than what her own back could carry. The arithmetic was brutal. If the mule died, the claim died with it. She tried the surface garden 3 times. Each attempt taught her something bitter. The wind desiccated exposed seedlings faster than she could water them. The afternoon sun on the south slope could scorch leaves flat against the soil, and rain came in bursts that scoured seed downhill rather than watering it. By the middle of July, she had spent nearly $1 on replacement seed and had nothing green to show for it. The failure did not teach her the answer. The failure taught her where not to look. A thunderstorm broke on a Tuesday night in mid-July, the kind that arrives with a wall of green light on the western horizon and a sound like freight wagons rolling across the sky. Rain hammered the cabin roof hard enough to drive water through the tarred paper in 4 places. Elva set pots beneath the worst drips and pulled a blanket over her shoulders and listened to the storm tear at the canvas door until exhaustion dragged her under. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The cabin floor was cold and damp. She stepped outside into air that smelled of wet sage and iron and walked the property to check for damage. The surface garden was ruined again. Mud had buried the radish row under a smooth brown tongue. A channel of runoff had cut through the bean bed like a plow furrow, carrying the plants and the topsoil downhill in a single muddy stream. The creek was running brown and fast, but when she climbed the slope behind the cabin and crouched beside her father's half-finished potato pit, she stopped. The pit was nothing elaborate. Amos had dug a rectangular hole 4 feet deep into the south-facing bank the previous autumn. He had lined the bottom with flat stones salvaged from the creek, covered the opening with 2 planks and a sheet of canvas weighted by rocks, and stored seed potatoes there through the winter. He had never built the proper root cellar he had intended. The pit was a placeholder, a thing done quickly while bigger plans waited. Elva pulled the canvas aside. The air that rose from the hole was not warm exactly, but it was steady. It was not the sharp cold of the dawn breeze that cut through her dress. It was not the damp chill of the cabin floor. It was a temperature that belonged to the ground itself, a stillness that the storm had not touched. She fetched the thermometer her father had hung beside the cabin door and carried it to the pit. She laid it flat against the stone floor and waited. When she checked it an hour later, the pit floor registered 12 degrees warmer than the outside dawn air. She checked it again at noon. The pit was cooler than the scorching surface, but still warmer than the overnight reading. The temperature moved, but slowly, as though the earth was thinking about the weather rather than reacting to it. She sat on the edge of the pit with her boots dangling and looked south. The slope caught sunlight from the moment it cleared the eastern ridge until it dropped behind the pine brakes in the late afternoon. The cabin, with its unfinished north wall and its gaps and its canvas door, received the same sun but gave its heat back through every crack before midnight. The dirt held on. The cabin let go. She did not yet understand what she was going to build. She understood only that the ground knew something her cabin did not. 2 days later, Bellamy stopped his wagon on the track below the claim. He had come to check whether Elva had reconsidered his offer of domestic work. He found her sitting beside the potato pit with the thermometer and a piece of charcoal, marking numbers on a flat board. "Keeping weather records will not feed you," Bellamy said from the track. "The pit was 12 degrees warmer than the air at dawn," Elva answered. 14 warmer the next morning. Bellamy climbed down and walked to the edge of the hole. He looked into it the way a man looks into a dry well, with a mixture of curiosity and certainty that nothing useful will come from the looking. "You cannot eat warm dirt," he told her. Elva wrote down the day's number and set the board aside. She did not argue. There was nothing to argue with yet. The memory arrived at night, the way useful things often do, not as an idea, but as a sensation, a warmth against the palm that had been waiting 20 years to mean something. Elva was 9 years old, kneeling beside her mother in the garden behind their Iowa farmhouse. Clara Mercer had built a low wooden frame against the south wall of the barn and covered it with a single glass sash scavenged from a broken window. Beneath the glass, a 6-inch layer of fresh horse manure steamed in the October air, giving off heat that fogged the underside of the pane. Above the manure, a thin bed of soil held parsley, cress, and lettuce starts that had no business being green so late in the season. Clara pressed Elva's palm against the outside of the glass. Cold. Then she lifted the sash with both hands and held Elva's hand above the soil. Warm. The smell rose thick, an animal manure and wet earth and crushed parsley mixing in a cloud that stung the eyes and settled in the chest. The glass traps what the sun gives, Clara said. The manure gives what the sun cannot reach. She replaced the sash and pointed at the green leaves pushing through the dark soil. Between the two of them, the plants do not know it is October. Clara Mercer died of pneumonia in the winter of 1884. She never knew that her daughter would carry that lesson across 400 miles of prairie and drive it into a hillside to stay alive. The memory did not hand Elva a finished plan. It gave her two truths that had always been separate and now pressed together with the force of necessity. Manure could warm soil from below, and glass could trap daylight from above. Her father's potato pit had added a third truth. The earth itself moderated temperature at depth, holding warmth when the surface froze, and coolness when the surface baked. 3 principles. No design. Not yet. She spent 3 mornings walking the south-facing slope with sharpened sticks. At dawn, she planted a stick where the first sunlight struck the bank. At noon, she planted another where the sun stood highest against the hillside. At sunset, she marked where the light departed. The 3-day record told her that the slope received direct sun for nearly the full span of the short winter day, while the cabin's north face sat in its own shadow from October through March. She sketched on the back of a feed receipt with a stub of pencil. Not a house, not a cellar. A long pit cut east to west across the slope. 24 feet long, 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep at center. The south-facing wall would be a low stone and sod curb, topped with salvaged glass sash, angled steeply toward the winter sun. The north wall would be cut 8 feet into the hillside, reinforced with timber and backed with stone to absorb sunlight during the day and release it slowly through the night. A manure bed for germination heat, straw mats stitched between burlap layers to cover the glass after sundown, an uphill drain behind the north wall, sloped to daylight downhill to keep the rain from turning her growing pit into a cistern. She calculated the excavation, more than 100 cubic yards of soil, even accounting for the slope. Months of labor with 1 shovel, 1 mattock, and a mule whose ribs she could count from 20 feet. The gamble was absolute. If she spent the summer digging instead of cutting wood and preserving food, and the pit failed, she would enter winter with less fuel, less food, and a useless hole in the hillside. If she played it safe, cut wood, dried what she could, tightened the cabin, she would survive until the stores ran out and then face the last weeks of winter with no plan at all. She chose the pit. She chose it because the safe path ended in the same place, only more slowly and with less dignity. Nell Acker arrived on a Friday morning in late July while Elva was driving stakes and stretching twine across the slope. Nell was 27, a neighboring homesteader who taught school in Chadron 2 days a week. She had walked 3 miles carrying a jar of plum preserves and a practical concern. Nell was not cruel. She was careful in the way that people who have survived difficulty become careful. She measured risk the way Elva measured sunlight, and she did not like what the measurement showed. "You are digging the wrong direction," Nell said, watching Elva pull the string taut between two stakes. "A root cellar goes straight down." "It is not a root cellar." Nell set the preserves on a flat stone and studied the string lines. They ran east to west across the face of the slope, marking a rectangle far wider and longer than any cellar or dugout she had seen. "What is it, then?" Elva explained. "The pit. The glass angled toward the winter sun, the stone wall to hold heat, the manure bed, the straw covers for nighttime, the drainage trench uphill." She laid out the logic piece by piece, not as a certainty, but as an argument she was still having with herself, each part resting on the next, the whole thing standing only if every piece held. Nell listened without interrupting. She watched Elva's hands trace the plan in the air, the angle of the glass, the depth of the pit, the slope of the drain. When Elva finished, Nell asked the question that would follow the project for months. "Suppose it warms at noon. The sun comes through the glass, the stone heats up, the plants are happy. Fine. But what happens after 3 days of cloud? 5 days? A week of gray sky with the temperature below zero? Where does the warmth come from then?" Elva did not lie. "I do not know. The earth holds temperature at depth. The stone and the water might hold enough to keep the roots alive, but I have not tested it through a week of cloud." "Then you are betting your life on the sun showing up when you need it." "I am betting on the ground holding what the sun leaves behind." Nell picked up the jar of preserves. "I hope you are right. I think you are digging your own grave and putting windows on it." She left the preserves on the stone. That was the kindness her doubt could not bring itself to swallow. Elva built the test pit that same week, 4 feet square, 3 feet deep, covered by a single sash frame pried from the cabin's one intact window. She mixed a layer of horse manure and straw beneath 6 inches of soil and planted cress seed. For 3 days the pit performed. The thermometer read 61 degrees at noon, 53 at midnight. The cress germinated fast, green threads pushing through dark soil, while the surface garden beside it continued to wilt in the July heat. It was working. The glass trapped the sun. The manure warmed the soil. The earth beneath held the temperature steady. On the 4th day, a heavy afternoon rain filled the pit to the brim in less than an hour. Water poured down the slope and found the lowest point, which was the center of her test. The south wall, cut from bare earth with no brace and no support, slumped inward under the weight of saturated soil and buried the seedlings under a tongue of brown mud. The sash frame tilted and slid into the muck. Water stood in the bottom like a mirror reflecting the gray sky. Elva knelt beside it and stared. Nell's question pulsed behind her ribs. She had proved that glass and earth and manure could trap warmth. She had also proved that water and gravity could destroy the trap before winter ever arrived. But the next morning she returned and checked the one corner that had not collapsed. The bed there, sheltered by a stone she had placed against the wall, was still warmer than the exposed soil at the surface. The cress roots in that corner were still alive. The principle had not failed. Her execution had. She stood over the ruined pit and made the decision that would determine whether she lived or starved. She would spend $11 more than half of everything she had, on salvaged sash frames, nails, lamp oil, putty ingredients, and rope. If the full structure failed after that purchase, she would enter winter with neither food from the garden nor money to pay Voss. She would lose the mule, and with it the claim, and with the claim the last thing her father had left in this world. $11? One chance. Chadron sat along the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley rail line, a cluster of frame buildings, false fronts, an ambition that had barely existed 3 years earlier. Elva drove Jack and the wagon 14 miles on a track that crossed 2 creeks and a stretch of sandy ground that bogged the wheels to the hubs. Jack pulled the wagon free each time, but his breathing was heavier than it should have been, and she could feel the effort cost him something he would not get back without better feed. She found the salvage from a dismantled railroad boarding house stacked behind the freight office. 24 sash frames, each roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, many with cracked panes and flaking putty. The railroad carpenter wanted them gone before the next shipment arrived. Elva offered to remove the frames herself, sort the usable glass from the broken, and return all sound hardware, hinges, screws, and brackets that the railroad might reuse. The carpenter agreed. It was less trouble than any other arrangement, and Elva was the only person standing in front of him that morning with a wagon and a willingness to haul broken glass. She spent the rest of the day wrapping panes in straw, stacking frames, and sorting hardware into a canvas bag. By late afternoon, the wagon was loaded. Every usable piece of glass she owned was balanced on a bed of straw behind a mule too thin to pull fast. She did not yet know that Clement Voss had visited the salvage foreman 2 days earlier. Voss was 44 years old, a merchant and minor land speculator whose store on Chadron's Main Street sold provisions, tools, dry goods, and credit at rates that compounded generously in his favor. He held the chattel note on Elva's mule and wanted her south-facing slope and the spring that broke from the rock just below the pine line. The spring was the real prize. Water on the northern plains was worth more than acreage, and Voss intended to assemble a grazing parcel from failed claims. Elva's quarter section, with its reliable spring and its sheltered slope, was the centerpiece. Voss had offered the salvage foreman a better price for the glass, not because he needed windows, but because he understood that a woman building something unusual needed materials, and materials denied could accomplish what argument could not. The foreman had accepted Voss's money, but the railroad carpenter who managed the physical removal of the salvage had not been told about the arrangement. By the time Voss learned that Elva had loaded 24 frames onto her wagon and was already on the track north, the glass was gone. Voss rode to the store and found Bellamy buying nails at the counter. "The Mercer girl is hauling windows into the hills," Voss said. 24 of them. Bellamy set his nails down. "What does she intend to build with 24 windows? A church?" "A hole in the ground," Voss said. "She means to dig a pit in that south slope and cover it with glass." Bellamy shook his head slowly. "A hole with windows is still a hole. January will fill it with ice, and you with dirt." The phrase traveled the way phrases do in small settlements, from the store counter to the livery to the road, and out along the claim tracks like water following a grade. Within a week, 3 versions of Bellamy's line circulated through Chadron and the surrounding homesteads. Some repeated it with concern, some repeated it with amusement. Children along the creek road began calling the excavation Mercer's grave, and 2 boys rode past the claim on a borrowed horse just to see whether the crazy woman was still digging. She was. Voss came to the claim himself on a Saturday, in late July. He rode a bay horse and wore a dark wool coat too heavy for the weather, which told Elva that he wanted to look like a man of authority rather than a man of comfort. He dismounted near the cabin and walked to the edge of the excavation where she stood waist deep in red clay, her arms streaked to the shoulders, her hair tied back with a strip of canvas. "I see you have been busy," Voss said. Elva drove the mattock into the pit wall and left it there. She climbed out and stood level with him. Jack stood tied to a post nearby, watching with the bottomless patience of a mule who had already been asked to drag 6 loads of soil that morning and expected no gratitude for any of them. "The note comes due December 1st, Voss said. $32. I will not extend it a day." "I did not ask you to extend it. You have spent money on glass that could have gone toward the debt. If December arrives and you cannot pay, I take the mule. Without the mule, you cannot work this claim. Without the claim, you have nothing to sell except yourself." He looked past her at the string lines marking the full 24-foot length of the excavation. "You have dug perhaps a quarter of this. August is half gone. The ground will freeze in October. You cannot finish." "I will finish," Elva said. "With what? 1 mule and a mattock?" "With what I have." Voss gathered his reins. He mounted and looked down at her from the saddle. A small man made tall by the horse beneath him and the debt in his pocket. "By snowfall, I will own the mule. By spring, I will own the hill." He said it quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for Elva to hear. It was not a threat. It was a schedule, and he believed in it the way he believed in interest rates and failed crops and the reliable mathematics of other people's desperation. Elva watched him ride south toward the track. When the dust settled, she dropped back into the pit and swung the mattock until her shoulders burned, and the clay peeled away in slabs, and the sun moved past the ridge, and the bottom of the trench filled with purple shadow. She could not do it alone. She knew this the way she knew the weight of clay, not because someone told her, but because she had lifted it. The excavation had reached roughly 2 feet of depth across the full 24-foot length. The north wall, cut into the hillside where the slope did part of the work, was approaching grade, but the deeper she went, the harder the digging became. Clay layers that had been soft near the surface turned dense and resistant 3 feet down, clinging to the mattock blade and forcing her to pry rather than swing. Stone shelves appeared without warning, flat slabs of sandstone buried in the clay that had to be broken with the sledge, each one costing an hour of labor for 6 inches of progress. Water seeped from the hillside after every rain and pooled in the low corner where her drainage trench was supposed to run, but did not yet exist because she had not had time to dig it. Every morning she woke before dawn with her hands so stiff she had to work them open and closed for several minutes before she could grip the mattock handle. Her palms were blistered, healed, and blistered again in layers that built up like bark. Her shoulders ached from the first swing and did not stop aching when she set the tool down at dark. Every evening she ate cornmeal mush and a small piece of salt pork and marked another day on the cabin wall with a stroke of charcoal. The strokes were adding up. July was gone. August was burning through its 2nd week. The pit was 1/4 excavated, and she was already behind the pace she needed to finish before frost locked the ground. The math pressed against her like the clay walls of the trench. She needed to move roughly 75 more cubic yards of soil. At her current pace, working alone, resting the mule every 3rd day, losing time to rain and stone, and the 100 small tasks of keeping herself alive, she would not finish until November. The ground would freeze in mid-October. Once it froze, The mattock would bounce off the surface like a hammer striking iron, and no amount of effort would move what the cold had locked in place. She needed someone who knew how to make earth walls stand. She needed someone who understood drainage, bracing, timber cribbing, and the weight of saturated soil against unsupported cuts. She needed help, and she had no money to buy it, no reputation to attract it, and no time to wait for it to arrive on its own. What she had was a pit, a string of measured stakes, and a slope that caught the winter sun. She also had a question that woke her every morning before the light and followed her into the trench and waited at the bottom while she worked. Could she finish before the ground froze, or would Voss's schedule prove more accurate than her own? The mattock struck stone. She pried it loose and threw it onto the spoil pile. Below it, the clay was darker, damper, and colder against her knuckles. She kept digging. Tell us in the comments, have you ever kept building while everyone around you was certain you would fail? The following dawn, Elva found a crack running the length of the south wall where the previous day's excavation had undercut the bank. The fissure was thin, barely the width of a pencil lead, but soil trickled from it in a steady whisper, grains falling onto the trench floor like sand through a broken hourglass. She pressed her hand against the wall beside the crack and felt the earth shift beneath her palm. Not collapsing, not yet, but loosening, thinking about it. She had no timber in place along that wall, no bracing, no cribbing. The south face was 4 feet of unsupported clay leaning over the trench where she spent 10 hours every day. If it let go while she was at the bottom, 24 feet of saturated earth would come down on her faster than she could turn around, and nobody would find the body until Voss came to collect the mule in December. Elva backed out of the trench and stood on the rim, breathing hard. The mule watched her from his post with one ear forward. The sun cleared the eastern ridge and struck the south-facing bank, warming the glass frame stacked against the cabin wall. Somewhere in the unfinished drainage line she had started, water dripped against stone in a rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down. She needed a carpenter. She needed a stonemason. She needed someone who could teach her how to hold this hillside in place long enough for it to become a wall instead of a burial. Mercer's grave. The children's name pressed against her ribs and stayed there, heavier than the clay on her boots, colder than the water seeping through the cracks. She did not go back into the trench that day. She sat on the edge with the level vial in her lap and watched the fissure widen by the width of a hair, and she calculated how many days she had before the wall decided for her. Chunk 2 continues. The axle broke on a Wednesday. Peter Kvama was driving a loaded freight wagon south along the ridge track when the left front wheel dropped into a washout hidden by grass. The yoke axle cracked at the shoulder, the wheel canted outward, and the wagon settled onto its belly with a sound like a tree splitting in a storm. Peter climbed down and examined the brake. The wood was sheared clean through. No amount of wedging or wiring would hold it under load. He needed a replacement spindle, and the nearest wheelwright was in Chadron, 14 miles south. He was 57 years old, Norwegian-born, with hands that had built railroad culverts, retaining walls, bridge abutments, and the glazed hotbeds of a Minnesota market gardener who grew lettuce through December. His hair was white at the temples, and his back was not what it had been, but his eyes missed nothing that involved the meeting of earth and timber. And when he walked the quarter-mile to Elva's claim to ask permission to camp while he waited for a new spindle, the first thing he noticed was not the half-dug pit or the stacked glass, or the thin young woman standing at the rim of the trench. The first thing he noticed was the string lines. They ran east to west across the slope in measured intervals, each one taut and level, each one pinned with stakes that had been driven plumb. But the floor of the trench, what he could see of it from above, was not level. It dropped, slightly, deliberately, and consistently toward the southern outlet. Peter crouched at the edge and studied the grade for a full minute before he spoke. Why does the floor fall toward the outlet? Elva looked up at him. She was standing in the trench with clay to her elbows and a mattock balanced against her hip. She had not expected a question. She had expected either an offer of help she could not afford or a verdict she did not need. Because the rain has to leave before I do, she said. Peter straightened. He looked at the string lines again. He looked at the stacked sash frames against the cabin. He looked at the south-facing slope and the angle of the sun on the bank and the unfinished drainage cut behind the north wall where water seeped from the hillside after every rain. You laid the grade with the level vial, he said. It was not a question. 1 inch in every 8 feet. Who taught you that? Nobody. The rain taught me. It flooded my test pit and killed the seedlings. I measured the slope I needed to move water faster than it could collect. Peter nodded slowly. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the cracking south wall that had stopped Elva's work the day before. I built hotbeds for a market gardener in Waseca County, he said. Glazed beds, forced lettuce, radishes, parsley through January. And before that, I braced cuts for the railroad, approaches, culverts, retaining walls on grades steeper than this one. He paused. Your south wall is going to fail. That crack will open to 6 inches after the next rain, but the grade is correct and you did not guess at it. He offered a trade. He would work in exchange for meals, a place to camp while his axle was repaired, and the right to correct anything in the construction that might kill them both. He was not offering charity. He was responding to competence, to a woman who had measured a drainage slope with a level vial and arrived at the right number without being told. Elva accepted because she had no choice, and because the crack in her south wall was widening by the hour, and because the man standing above her trench had looked at the string lines before he looked at her. Peter's first demand made no sense to Elva, and she resented it for 6 days. He insisted that before she deepened the main pit by another inch, they must complete the uphill drainage trench behind the north wall. The drain would run 32 feet along the back of the excavation, filled with rubble, gravel, broken crockery, and brush, sloped to daylight at the downhill end. A sod lip along the uphill edge would divert surface runoff before it could reach the pit. 6 days of digging a trench that would never grow a single plant. 6 days of hauling stone and gravel and smashing crockery into fragments while the main excavation sat unfinished and the calendar pages turned. Elva argued. She told Peter that every day spent on drainage was a day stolen from the structure itself. Peter listened to the argument without changing expression. When she finished, he picked up a bucket, filled it from the creek, carried it to the head of the rubble trench, and poured. The water entered the gravel and vanished. No pooling, no hesitation. It threaded through the rubble like a living thing, following the grade Elva had already cut, and emerged at the downhill outlet in a clear stream that ran across the exposed rock and disappeared into the grass. A wall only has to fail once, Peter said. A drain has to work every time. You build the drain first because the wall cannot survive without it. They lined the trench with flat stones, broken crockery, brush, and coarse gravel. They packed the sod lip with clay and tamped it until it shed water like a roof. When the next rain came, a hard July downpour that lasted 2 hours, the runoff split at the lip and flowed around the excavation instead of into it. The pit floor stayed dry. Elva did not thank Peter. She wrote the rain date and the result on her measurement board and set it beside the thermometer readings. Peter saw the board and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that might have been approval. The wall cribbing lesson came next. Peter showed Elva that the south wall's crack had formed because she had cut the face vertical, straight up and down like a mine shaft, Earth walls were not mine shafts. They needed batter, a slight inward lean that used the weight of the soil above to press the face together rather than pull it apart. They installed timber uprights, 4 by 6 posts salvaged from Peter's wagon bed, at 3-foot intervals along the north wall. Between the uprights, they fitted horizontal planks, each one pressed tight against the earth face. Diagonal braces ran from the base of each upright to the top of the next, creating a lattice that transferred the hillside's pressure downward into the stone floor rather than outward into the pit. Peter made Elva listen to the wall. "Put your ear against the plank," he told her. "What do you hear?" She pressed her cheek against the rough timber. At first, nothing. Then a faint sound, grains of soil ticking against the wood, each one a tiny percussion, irregular and quiet, but continuous. "That is the wall settling," Peter said. "If the ticking becomes steady and fast, the wall is moving. If you hear a creak from the braces, the load is shifting. If you hear a dull pop, a sound like a knuckle cracking, get out of the pit. Do not collect tools. Do not look back. Get out." A thunderstorm tested the unfinished bracing in the last week of July. Rain saturated the hillside above the excavation. The sod lip caught most of the surface water and sent it to the drainage trench, but groundwater pushed through the clay below the lip and pressed against the north wall from behind. One corner moved 3 inches. Elva saw the gap open between plank and post like a mouth forming a word, and then the diagonal brace caught the load and held. The timber groaned. The ticking accelerated to a rapid patter. Then it slowed. The corner stabilized. 3 inches of movement. The brace had saved the chamber. Without it, the entire north face would have entered the pit like a slow wave, and everything beneath it, plants, tools, Elva, would have been buried under tons of wet clay. Peter examined the corner the next morning. He showed Elva where the brace had compressed against the upright, leaving a dent in the wood 1/2 an inch deep. "That dent is the weight of the hillside," he said. "Remember what it looks like." August burned through its second half. The excavation deepened. Elva and Peter worked from first light until the sun dropped behind the ridge, stopping only to eat, water the mule, and check the drainage outlet. Elva's hands toughened past blisters into hard calluses that cracked at the knuckles and bled when the air dried. Her arms were brown to the shoulders and thin with muscle she had not owned in May. She ate twice a day and gave the mule the better portion, and Peter noticed this and said nothing about it, though he began splitting his own meals and leaving a portion on the stone beside the cabin where Elva would find it without having to acknowledge it as a gift. They installed the sash frames in stages. Peter showed Elva that a tiny gap around a pane, even the width of a straw, could undo hours of sunlight by letting warm air escape and cold air enter. They bedded every pane in putty made from whiting and linseed oil, pressing it into the joints with a flat stick until the seal was tight and smooth. They overlapped the frames so rain would run outward from one sash to the next rather than pooling between them. They installed hinged upper vents that could be opened on warm days to release moisture and closed at night to trap heat. Peter insisted on straw mats for every section of glazing, removable panels stitched between burlap layers, thick enough to slow heat loss through the glass after sundown. Elva objected. "Covering and uncovering them doubles my work. Every morning I pull them off. Every evening I put them back. That is an hour of labor that grows nothing." "Then decide," Peter said, "whether you are building for noon or for 4 in the morning. At noon, the sun does the work. At 4 in the morning, only the mats stand between your plants and frost. If you want to survive one, build for the other. She stitched the mats. Rye straw between burlap sheets, each one the width of a sash frame, heavy enough to stay in place against wind, light enough for one person to handle from inside the pit. It took 3 days to stitch all 24. Her fingers bled from the needle. She kept stitching. The hotbed was the last piece and the most temperamental. They built a raised bed at the center of the growing space, 24 square feet, using layers of fresh horse manure, straw, and soil. Peter warned that fresh manure could generate enough heat to cook seeds rather than germinate them. The chemistry was not complicated, but it was unforgiving. Too much nitrogen and not enough carbon, and the bed would spike to temperatures that killed everything planted in it. Too little manure, and the bed would compact and go cold within a week. Elva built the first batch too hot. She packed the manure tight, added too little straw, and planted cress seed in the soil above it. 2 days later, the soil surface was warm to the touch, but 3 inches down, the temperature was high enough to curl the seed casings into brown husks. She dug them out and started over. The second batch was too cold. She mixed so much straw that the manure could not decompose fast enough to generate useful heat. The bed compacted into a dense mat that felt cool and inert, like soil that had forgotten it was supposed to be alive. The third batch stabilized. Peter showed her how to test the temperature by driving a metal rod into the center of the bed, leaving it for 10 minutes, then pulling it out and pressing it against the inside of her wrist. If the rod felt warm but not hot, the same temperature as a bowl of soup that had cooled enough to drink, the bed was ready. She planted the third batch and watched it germinate in 4 days. Cress, mustard, and spinach pushed through the dark soil in pale green lines that looked impossibly fragile against the heavy brown earth surrounding them. Progress markers accumulated on Elva's measurement board like a second calendar. July 15th. Drainage complete, excavation 1/4 finished. August 1st. North wall braced to full depth, stone backing begun. August 18th. First 6 rafters installed across the pit, each one notched into the uprights and pinned with oak pegs. September 5th. 12 of 24 sash frames glazed and seated in putty. September 20th. The $19 reduced to $3.10 after purchasing putty ingredients, lamp oil, nails, and rope. September 23rd. The mule went lame. A stone bruise on the right front hoof that left Jack unwilling to bear weight. Elva hauled stone by hand for 4 days while the hoof healed, dragging loads on a canvas sheet across ground that was beginning to harden with the first breath of autumn cold. September 26th. Elva cut her palm carrying a cracked sash frame. The glass edge opened a 2-inch gash across the base of her thumb that bled through 3 wrappings before it clotted. She worked the rest of the day one-handed because stopping meant losing daylight she could not recover. October 2nd. A windstorm struck without warning. 2 uncovered sash frames, the last pair waiting for putty, tore loose from their temporary mountings and shattered against the stone wall. Glass fragments scattered across the growing beds. Elva spent the next morning picking shards from the soil on her hands and knees while the wind continued to push against every surface that could catch it. 7 openings in the roof remained exposed. The first hard frost arrived on October 7th and coated the surface garden in silver. The lettuce Elva had planted outside as a comparison bed turned black by noon. Inside the pit, the 12 sealed bays held warmth. The 7 open bays did not. Nell arrived after the windstorm. She did not apologize for doubting. She did not offer an opinion about the structure's chances. She brought 2 rolls of burlap and spent the afternoon sitting beside Elva on the edge of the pit, stitching straw mats. They worked without speaking for the first hour. Then Nell asked a question about the drainage grade, and Elva answered, and the conversation continued in the practical language of women who understand that help given without commentary is worth more than help wrapped in conditions. It was the first unexpected assistance, and it arrived at the moment Elva needed it most. Voss appeared 3 days later to collect part of the mule note. He saw Pater's braces and the timbered walls and the rows of sash gleaming in the autumn light. "You hired labor you cannot afford," Voss said to Elva. "He is not hired," Elva said. "He works in exchange for meals." Pater emerged from the pit with a plank across his shoulder. He looked at Voss the way a carpenter looks at a crack in a foundation, with professional assessment and no particular emotion. "I'm not employed," Pater said. "I'm repaying hospitality." Voss turned back to Elva. "Then he is working for a crop that will never exist." Elva paid him $2. It left her with $1.10 and a debt that still held the mule, the claim, and every hour of labor she had invested. Voss took the money and rode south without looking at the pit again. The final sash was installed on October 28th. Pater and Elva sealed the last bay, checked every joint, and performed a controlled overnight test. Pater hung thermometers at 3 locations: the south-facing glass, the center-growing bed, and the stone-backed north wall. He placed a 4th thermometer outside the pit on a post. They sealed the hatch, covered every sash with straw mats at sundown, and waited. The readings marked the structure's first full performance. Sunset outside, 31 degrees. Sunset inside, 61. The glass had trapped a full day of October sun, and the stone wall radiated warmth like a banked stove. Midnight inside, 51. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 6 hours, but the rate was slowing. The earth floor and the water-filled casks Elva had placed along the north wall were absorbing and releasing heat in a slow rhythm. Dawn outside, 18 degrees. Dawn greenhouse air, 44. Root bed temperature, 49. The structure had prevented frost during a clear autumn night when the outside air dropped below 20. It had not been tested in wind, in cloud, or in the sustained sub-zero cold that January would bring. But the numbers on the board were real, and they meant that the growing beds had stayed above freezing while the world outside the glass had not. At midday the following day, the air inside reached 71 degrees. Condensation formed heavily on the glass, thick droplets running down the inner surface and dripping onto the growing beds. Elva watched the water fall and felt triumph rising in her chest. Pater opened the upper vents. Cool air entered. The condensation slowed. "Moisture will rot your plants and your frames," he said. "Warm and wet is not warm and safe. You must vent whenever the sun returns, even in January, even when it costs you 5 degrees. Bellamy visited on the last day of October. He walked through the hatch and stood in the center of the greenhouse, his hat in his hands, and looked at the rows of spinach and mustard greens pushing through the dark soil. He checked the thermometer. He touched the stone wall and pulled his hand back at its warmth. "The spinach is alive," Bellamy said. He sounded like a man conceding a point in a debate he intended to continue. "It is," Elva said. "One fair night is not January," Bellamy said. "January lasts 5 weeks. January brings cloud and wind and temperatures that will pull the heat from this glass faster than your stone can give it back. One night below 20 is not the same as 10 nights below 0. He replaced his hat and climbed out through the hatch. He did not say the pit would fail. He did not say it would succeed. He left the verdict to January, which was the only authority he trusted. Pater departed on November 3rd. He had accepted a carpentry contract near Fort Robinson, framing work that would pay cash he needed for the winter. Before he left, he gave Elva his small carpenter's square, a a tool he had carried from Minnesota and used on every job since. He made her repeat the 3 emergency rules. Keep runoff out, Elva said, always. Keep the glass covered after sundown. Every night, no exceptions. Vent moisture whenever sunlight returns. Even in January, even when it costs you degrees. Pater placed the square in her hand and closed her fingers around it. The structure will talk to you, he said. The ticking, the creaking, the way the condensation forms and moves. Listen to it. It will tell you what it needs before it tells you what has gone wrong. He climbed onto the repaired wagon and drove south toward Fort Robinson. Elva stood beside the hatch with the carpenter's square in her hand and watched the wagon grow small against the brown prairie until it disappeared behind the first ridge. She was alone again. The structure was complete. The mentor was gone. And winter was 3 days early. Snow began on November 6th, earlier and heavier than anyone in the settlement had expected. The first fall buried the surface garden and the track to Chadron under 4 inches of white. The second fall, 2 days later, added 6 more. The creek froze at its edges. The wind shifted north and stayed there. Inside Elva's pit, spinach and mustard continued growing. Slowly, the low November sun entered at a sharp angle, and the days were short. But the roots pushed deeper, and the leaves reached toward the light that filtered through the glass. Her remaining tomato vine, planted against the warm stone wall in August, stopped setting fruit. Elva pinched off every flower so the plant would not waste energy trying to produce what the light could no longer support. The true test came in the 3rd week of November. Clouds covered the sky for 4 consecutive days. No sun reached the glass. The stone wall cooled degree by degree. The water casks stopped radiating and began absorbing what little warmth the air still held. By the 5th dawn, the greenhouse thermometer read 39 degrees. The root bed held at 47, but the air above the growing rows was approaching the edge of frost. A few more degrees, and the spinach leaves would crystallize. Bellamy's question, Nell's question, the question that had followed the project from the beginning, pressed against Elva's chest with the weight of 4 sunless days. Where does the warmth come from when the sun does not show up? She rebuilt the manure bed with fresh material from the mule's shelter. She hung a canvas curtain across the middle of the greenhouse, reducing the volume that had to stay warm by half. She pulled extra straw mats over the exposed glass and piled stones on them to hold against the wind. The clouds broke on the 6th day. Sunlight struck the glass at mid-morning, and the temperature climbed from 38 to 54 in 2 hours. The crisis passed, but Elva wrote the number 39 on her measurement board and circled it because that was the edge, and she needed to remember how thin it was. January arrived the way January arrives on the northern plains, not with a single blow, but with a tightening, a slow compression of cold and wind and short gray light that squeezed the world smaller each day. The temperature dropped below 0 on the 3rd. It rose above 0 on the 5th. It dropped again on the 7th and did not come back. On January 9th, 1887, the wind shifted hard to the north. Snow that had been falling in soft curtains became horizontal, driven by gusts that erased the track to Chadron and turned the air into a white wall that ended 3 feet from Elva's face. The outdoor thermometer dropped through 0 in the early afternoon and kept falling. Elva had read storms before. She had lived through Nebraska winters as a child in Iowa and had listened to her father describe the plains blizzards that buried cattle standing upright. But this storm did not sound like the ones her father described. This one sounded like the sky had broken open, and everything behind it was rushing through the gap. She moved fast. She pulled every straw mat across the glass and weighted them with stones. She closed the upper vents and sealed the edges with rags twisted into the frames. She checked the drainage outlet, still clear, water trickling through the gravel. She brought extra stones inside and placed them near the manure bed where they could absorb what warmth remained. She filled the water casks to the brim because water held heat longer than air, and every degree stored in those casks was a degree the growing beds would not have to surrender. Wind found the seams. Fine powder snow forced through one sash joint where the putty had cracked during the November freeze. The snow melted on the warm interior glass and dripped onto the lettuce bed. Elva packed the crack with folded cloth and softened putty from a jar she kept near the small cook stove in the sleeping chamber. The leak stopped. Another would open before midnight. The manure bed remained warm. The canvas curtain held the heated air in the smaller growing section. But the far end of the greenhouse, the 12 feet beyond the curtain where the less hardy crops grew, dropped below 45 degrees before dark. Near dusk, pounding shook the outer hatch. Elva opened it into a wall of wind and snow that pushed her backward. Nell Acker fell through the opening with her 8-year-old nephew, Owen, clinging to her coat. They had been driving a borrowed wagon toward Chadron when the storm struck. The wagon stalled less than a mile east of Elva's claim. Nell had unhitched the horse and led Owen on foot, following the fence line until she found the path to the pit. Owen's fingers were white and numb. He held them against his body and would not open his hands. Nell's right cheek was frostbitten, a patch of skin the color of candle wax that she did not seem to feel. Elva moved them through the airlock one at a time, closing the outer hatch between each entry to prevent dumping the greenhouse's stored warmth into the storm. The hatch was heavy, and the wind fought her. She braced it with her shoulder and pulled Nell through, then closed it again, then opened it for Owen, then sealed it and dropped the bar. 3 people in a space built for one. The additional breathing raised the humidity. Moisture condensed on the glass and began running in streams. Elva faced a choice that had no correct answer. Vent the moisture and lose heat, or keep the heat and let the damp rot the frames and encourage mold on the plants. She split the difference. She kept the sleeping chamber warmer with the small stove, enough to dry Nell's and Owen's clothes, while leaving the greenhouse section unheated, except for the manure bed. The canvas curtain between the 2 spaces served as a crude humidity barrier. It was not enough, but it was what she had. Snow accumulated on the straw mats through the night. What had been insulation became a crushing weight. Each hour added another inch of dense, wind-packed snow that pressed the mats against the glass and the glass against the rafters. Elva heard the frames creak, a sound like knuckles flexing, and knew the load was approaching the limit of what Pater's bracing could hold. She crawled along an interior plank that ran the length of the greenhouse and pushed upward against each roof bay with a wooden pole. The pole transmitted the load from her shoulders through the plank to the rafter, lifting the snow just enough to relieve the pressure on the glass. She worked from the hatch end to the far wall and back, one bay at a time, listening for the sound that Pater had taught her to fear, the dull pop of a brace reaching its limit. On the 4th bay, a pane cracked. The fracture ran from corner to corner in a single line, dividing the glass into 2 triangles that shifted against each other when the wind gusted. But the putty held. The frame held. The pane did not fall. It hung in its cradle of dried oil and whiting and creaked with every gust like a door on a failing hinge. Elva tried to brace the cracked pane from inside. She reached up with one hand to press a flat board against the glass. The board slipped. The edge of the broken pane caught her right forearm and opened a cut 4 inches long. Blood ran down her wrist and dripped onto the soil below. She pressed her left hand over the wound and held it until the bleeding slowed, then wrapped it with a strip torn from her underskirt. Her right hand weakened. She could grip the pole, but not the finer tools. She worked the rest of the night mostly one-handed. If you're invested in Elva's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because the next decision determines whether all three of them see morning. The wind blocked the low intake vent with packed snow sometime after midnight. The sleeping chamber's small stove, which drew its air through the vent, began drafting poorly. Smoke backed into the room in thin blue layers that hung at ceiling height and then descended. Owen coughed. Nell pressed a wet cloth over his face. Elva killed the stove fire. She smothered it with ash and closed the damper, and the sleeping chamber went dark and began to cool. Without the stove, the only heat sources were the manure bed, the water casks, the stone wall, and the body warmth of 3 people breathing in a sealed space. Then she heard the sound Petter had described. Not the creak of timber, not the tick of settling soil, but a steady patter behind the north wall. Grains falling against the boards, in a rhythm too fast and too regular for normal settling. The drainage outlet had frozen. Meltwater from an earlier warm spell, water that should have been flowing downhill through the gravel trench, was backing up behind the north wall. The pressure was building against the timber and the earth behind it. If the water found a gap between the planks, it would enter the greenhouse as a flood of icy mud. If it did not find a gap, the pressure would push the wall inward until the braces failed. Elva remembered the dent in the wood, 1/2 inch deep, the weight of the hillside. She crawled to the narrow inspection opening that Peter had built into the drainage access, a gap between 2 planks, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and pushed through into the rubble trench. The space was dark and tight and smelled of wet stone and cold earth. She could hear water moving somewhere ahead, but it was not flowing freely. It was pressing against something solid. She took a heated iron rod from the stove surround, the metal still warm from the fire she had killed minutes ago, and drove it into the gravel at the outlet end of the drain. The rod struck ice. She hammered it deeper, twisting, feeling the ice resist and then fracture around the hot metal. Water seeped around the rod. She pulled it back, reheated it against her body. Not enough, not nearly enough, and drove it in again. The ice plug broke. Water surged through the outlet and ran downhill beneath the drift. Inside the greenhouse, the patter against the north wall slowed, then stopped. Elva backed out of the inspection opening with clay on her face and ice water soaking her sleeves to the shoulders. She was shaking, not from fear, from cold that had entered her bones during the minutes she had spent lying in the rubble trench with her arms in frozen gravel. Nell could not use her frostbitten hands well enough to hold tools, but she could hold the lantern and read the thermometer. She called out the numbers every 15 minutes, while Elva circled the greenhouse checking seams, pressing straw mats against the glass, and listening to the structure talk. Midnight outside, approximately 20 degrees below zero. Midnight greenhouse 41. 2 in the morning, greenhouse 39. The stone wall was surrendering its last stored heat. The water casks had cooled to the air temperature and stopped contributing. Pre-dawn outside, approximately 28 below zero. Pre-dawn greenhouse 37. Root bed 47. The tomato vine at the exposed southern edge, the one section of the greenhouse beyond the canvas curtain, died. The leaves blackened and curled. The 2 fruits that had been ripening slowly since October softened and collapsed. One bruised tomato survived at the center of the vine, sheltered by the mass of the plant around it. An exception, a remnant. But the spinach held, the mustard held, the cress held. The turnip tops and the radishes and the scallions pushed into the soil behind the canvas curtain held. The parsley, gray-green and still, held. The root bed at 47 degrees held. The lettuce, fragile and pale, held. The measurable victory was not tropical warmth. It was not 75 degrees. It was 37 degrees in a space surrounded by air that had dropped to 28 below zero. It was the difference between frozen solid and still alive. It was a margin of 65 degrees maintained by earth, stone, glass, straw, putty, and the drainage trench that a young woman had resented building until she understood what it was for. At dawn, the wind did not stop, but the snow thinned enough to see 30 feet. Elva cleared the intake vent with a broom handle and relit the stove in the sleeping chamber. Owen fell asleep against the warm earth wall with his hands wrapped in flannel. Nell sat beside him and stared at the thermometer without speaking. Across the settlement, the storm pressed against every structure that stood above the ground. A traveler attempting to reach town was found near Bellamy's mill shed, alive but nearly frozen, his feet white to the ankles. Bellamy's family dragged him inside and worked his circulation back, but 2 toes on the left foot would later require amputation. Voss's store cellar, built at shallow depth in flat ground with no drainage and no insulation, fell below freezing. Barrels of preserved potatoes split as the water inside them expanded to ice. Voss lost nearly a third of his winter inventory in a single night. The storm continued for 2 more days. Elva maintained the greenhouse through a rotation that consumed every hour. Clear snow from the mats, check the drainage outlet, vent moisture when the sun appeared, seal the vents when it vanished, feed the manure bed, read the thermometers, feed Owen, tend Nell's hands, sleep in fragments against the warm wall. 4 days after the storm began, the wind dropped. The sky opened into a blue so deep it looked like water. The temperature remained well below zero, but the air was still, and for the first time in nearly 100 hours, Elva could see the full length of the valley from the hatch opening. Bellamy, Voss, and 2 neighbors rode toward the claim that morning. They had seen no smoke from the cabin. They had seen no movement. The track was buried. The last anyone had heard from Elva Mercer was before the storm, and the settlement's collective assumption was that the cabin was empty or its occupant was dead. They found the outer cabin drifted almost to the eaves. Snow filled the window frame and pressed against the canvas door. The woodpile beside the east wall was nearly untouched, less than a cord, barely diminished from its autumn height. A single trail of packed footprints led from the cabin to the hillside, ending at a drift that rose above the contour of the slope. Bellamy dismounted and followed the trail. He reached the drift and saw the edge of the hatch protruding from the snow. Vapor rose from a gap between the hatch and its frame, a thin column of warm air that dissolved into the frozen sky. He lifted the hatch. Warm air struck his face. His spectacles fogged instantly, and he pulled them off and wiped them on his coat sleeve. The air that rose from the opening smelled of damp earth, green leaves, horse manure, and the close warmth of a room where people had been breathing. It was late morning. The sun had been on the exposed glass for several hours, and the straw mats that Elva had pulled back at dawn let the light pour through the south-facing panes at the steep winter angle the structure had been built to receive. The thermometer at the center of the greenhouse read 72 degrees. Elva stood in the growing space in rolled sleeves, her right arm bandaged from wrist to elbow. Nell sat on a low bench cutting lettuce into a bowl. Owen knelt beside the dark soil of the growing bed and pulled a radish from the earth, shaking the dirt from its root with the casual confidence of a child who had been doing this all morning. The checking party looked down into rows of spinach, mustard, scallions, cress, and turnip tops. Parsley grew in a thick cluster near the stone wall. A shallow bed of carrots and small turnips showed green tops above the soil. At the center, beside the manure bed, one bruised tomato hung from the surviving half of the vine. Not a crop, not an abundance, but an impossible remnant of summer persisting in a space that the settlement had called a grave. Bellamy stood at the edge of the hatch with his hat in his hands and his spectacles still streaked with condensation. He looked at the lettuce in Nell's bowl. He looked at the radish in Owen's fist. He looked at the thermometer reading 72 degrees, while the air above him stood at 4 below zero. He did not speak. Voss stood behind him on the snow. He looked into the pit. He looked at the rows. He looked at Elva, who looked back at him without expression, and he turned away and walked to his horse without a word. The hatch stayed open. Warm air continued to rise from the hillside into the frozen sky, carrying the smell of green things growing in January, and the four men who had come expecting a body stood in the snow and watched it dissolve above their heads. Chunk 3 continues. Bellamy returned 2 days after the checking party. He came alone, on foot, carrying a surveyor's notebook and a pencil that he sharpened with a folding knife while standing beside the hatch. He did not ask permission to enter. He climbed down the slope steps and stood in the center of the greenhouse and turned a slow circle, the way he had turned inside the cabin 9 months earlier when he had counted Elva's stores and pronounced them insufficient. But this time he was not counting sacks. He was counting degrees. He checked the thermometer at the stone wall, 58. He checked the root bed, 49. He opened his notebook and wrote both numbers. He crouched beside the spinach row and pressed his thumb into the soil. Damp, unfrozen. He wrote that down too. He examined the drainage outlet from outside, noting the clear trickle of water emerging from the gravel into a channel that ran downhill beneath the snow. He examined the timber cribbing along the north wall, running his hand across each brace joint the way Pater had taught Elva to listen for movement. He examined the sash frames, the putty seals, the hinged vents, and the cracked pane that Elva had braced with a flat board and 2 wedges. The inspection took 40 minutes. Elva watched him from the far end of the greenhouse, where she was transplanting mustard seedlings from the hotbed into a cleared row. She did not interrupt. She understood that Bellamy was not visiting. He was conducting an audit, and the audit needed to reach its own conclusion. When he finished, Bellamy sat on the stone ledge near the hatch and looked at the rows of green. His notebook was open on his knee. He had filled 2 pages with numbers, measurements, and brief notes in a hand so small Elva could not read it from across the room. "Your root bed held 47 during the worst night," he said. It did. Surface root cellars across the settlement dropped below freezing. Voss lost 1/3 of his stored potatoes. I heard. Bellamy closed the notebook and tapped the pencil against its cover. The sound was quiet and rhythmic, like the ticking of soil against timber that Pater had taught Elva to interpret. "I told you a hole with windows was still a hole," he said. "I told you January would fill it with ice." "You did." The ice stopped at the door. He put the pencil in his coat pocket and stood. "I was wrong about the hole. I was not wrong about the danger. A poorly built version of this, yet no drainage, no bracing, shallow depth, flat ground radars, would have killed you. You did not build a poorly built version." It was not an apology. It was an assessment, delivered in the same tone he used to evaluate road grades and mill timbers. But it was the first time Rufus Bellamy had told another person on this stretch of prairie that he had been wrong, and the weight of it sat in the greenhouse air like heat from the stone wall, invisible but present. He climbed out of the hatch and turned back. 6 families have asked me what you built, he said. I told them I would look at it before I answered. I have looked at it. He settled his hat. I will tell them it works. I will also tell them that a pit dug in flat clay without a drainage trench will collapse and drown whoever is inside it. Your design requires slope, gravel, timber, and someone who knows what they are doing. That is not a criticism. That is the truth. The families came in pairs and alone, on horseback and on foot, through the remaining weeks of January and into February. Each one climbed down the hatch and stood in the warm air and looked at the green rose and asked questions that Elva answered with the measurement board in her hand. A German homesteader named Falk wanted to know whether a pit facing southeast instead of south would work. Elva showed him her sun-tracking stakes and explained that every degree away from true south reduced the winter light the glass could capture. She did not tell him no. She told him how to measure his own slope and calculate his own angle. A widow named Gerda Stensland, who ran a small dairy 3 miles east, asked whether the warm air would keep milk from freezing. Elva explained that the greenhouse air was warm enough to protect plants, but not warm enough to keep liquid above 40 degrees through a prolonged cold snap. She suggested an earth-banked storage room sharing one wall with a heated, growing space, a compromise that used the moderated temperature of the ground without depending on solar gain alone. A young couple from the creek settlement asked whether they could grow tomatoes in January. Elva told them the truth. The greenhouse produced greens, roots, herbs, and seedlings reliably. Tomatoes needed sustained warmth and long light that a passive structure could not provide in midwinter. She showed them the dead vine and the single bruised fruit that had survived only by accident. She did not inflate what the pit could do. She had learned from the test pit, from the 4 days of cloud, and from the night the temperature dropped to 37 degrees that the margin between working and failing was thinner than the glass above her head. She refused payment for the basic design. She drew site plans on scrap paper and explained drainage, bracing, and ventilation to anyone who asked. But she added a condition that surprised the visitors. She would help mark sites, but would not endorse pits dug in flat clay near a high water table or without a demonstrated drainage outlet. A poorly drained imitation could collapse. A collapsed pit could kill someone. She had heard the wall move in July. She knew the sound. Nell's conversion was quieter than Bellamy's. It happened without a speech. Through the rest of January and into February, Nell came to the greenhouse every 3rd day. She brought burlap, straw, or dried grass for the mats. She brought Owen, who had developed a proprietary attachment to the radish bed and considered himself responsible for its output. She asked questions, not the skeptical questions of the previous summer, but the operational questions of someone learning a system. How often to vent, how to read the condensation patterns on the glass, how to test the manure bed's temperature with the iron rod. One afternoon, Nell knelt beside the growing bed and pressed her bare hand into the soil. She held it there for a long moment, feeling the warmth that rose from below, the faint pulse of decomposing manure feeding heat into the root zone. "This is what you meant," she said, "when you told me you were bedding on the ground holding what the sun left behind." "I was guessing then," Elva said. "You were guessing well." Nell began testing the soil temperature at the school garden that week, a surface plot that froze solid every winter and produced nothing between November and April. She wrote the numbers on a slate and compared them with Elva's root bed readings. The difference was consistent and damning. Elva's buried beds held 46 to 52 degrees, while the school's surface soil sat at 20 to 25. The gap was the depth of the earth between them. Voss did not visit the greenhouse. He did not ask for measurements. He did not congratulate Elva or acknowledge the survival of Nell and Owen. What Voss did was calculate. He calculated that the checking party story would spread. He calculated that Elva's claim, which he had valued as distressed property available for acquisition, was now worth more to her alive than it would ever be worth to him in foreclosure. He calculated that the families asking for her plans were families who would remember that Voss had tried to take her mule while she was building the thing that saved their neighbors. He did not alter the terms of the note. He did not extend the deadline. He did not reduce the interest. He waited, because waiting was what Voss did best, and because he believed that one winter did not prove a method any more than one hand of cards proved a gambler. But something had shifted in the mathematics of the settlement, and Voss could feel it the way Elva had learned to feel the wall settling, a slow, steady redistribution of weight that had not yet reached its resting place. Peter Kvamme returned from Fort Robinson in late February, driving the same wagon on the same repaired axle. He found Elva's greenhouse producing its first late winter crop: spinach, lettuce, mustard, cress, and scallions harvested in rotation, each row replanted as soon as it was cut. The manure bed held a flat of seedlings, early cabbage and onion starts that would be ready for transplanting when the ground thawed. He climbed down the hatch and stopped. The canvas curtain he had never seen was strung across the center of the space, dividing the greenhouse into a warm zone and a cool zone. The inspection opening in the drainage access hour, his design, built for maintenance, had been widened by 3 inches and fitted with a removable board that allowed Elva to reach the outlet without crawling through the full length of the rubble trench. The cracked pane from the storm had been replaced with 2 smaller pieces of glass, overlapped and sealed with double putty, a repair method Peter had not taught her because the situation had never arisen while he was present. He looked at these modifications the way a teacher looks at a student's work that has gone beyond the lesson, with recognition, surprise, and the faint discomfort of realizing that the student no longer needs the teacher in the same way. He told Bellamy later, at the store, "I taught her to brace a wall. She taught the wall what it was for." Through the spring and early summer of 1887, Peter and Elva rebuilt the weakest elements of the greenhouse together. They replaced the cracked glazing with smaller panes that were easier to handle and cheaper to replace when they broke. They divided the growing space into 3 temperature zones using canvas curtains that could be raised or lowered depending on the weather. They built a second entrance, creating a true airlock that prevented the heat dump Elva had struggled with when Nell and Owen arrived during the storm. They deepened the drainage outlet and protected it with a stone box that would resist freezing longer than the bare gravel had. They argued about most of it. Peter wanted the shelving along the north wall, built at fixed heights. Elva wanted it adjustable, pegged into the upright so she could raise or lower the shelves as the sun angle changed through the season. Peter said fixed shelves were stronger. Elva said strength meant nothing if the bottom shelf sat in shadow for 3 months of the year. They compromised. Fixed framing with removable shelf boards that could be repositioned. Neither was fully satisfied, which meant the design was probably correct. They separated the humid growing air more completely from the sleeping chamber by adding a second canvas wall and a ventilation gap that allowed airflow without direct moisture transfer. They added a whitewashed board above the stone wall on the north side to reflect winter light back toward the growing beds. The reflected light was not strong, but in the darkest weeks of December, every additional hour of illumination kept the plants growing instead of dormant. Elva kept written records of everything, air temperatures at dawn, noon, and dusk, root bed temperatures, sowing dates, germination times, and harvest weights, crop failures, which varieties bolted, which froze at the edges, which succumbed to mold in humid weather, broken panes, replaced putty, drainage inspections. She recorded the names of families who copied the design and the modifications they made. The measurement board that had begun as a scrap of pine became a shelf of ledgers, each one filled with numbers that meant nothing to a casual reader and everything to someone trying to replicate the work. She learned that the greenhouse produced slowly during the darkest weeks and should be filled with mature, cold-hardy plants before midwinter, rather than expected to germinate everything in December. She learned to stagger planting so that lettuce and spinach matured in rotation rather than all at once. She learned that the manure bed needed fresh material every 6 weeks, and that the transition between old and new batches was the most dangerous period. 2 days when the germination flat had no reliable heat source. Pater helped build a smaller earth-banked glass house beside Nell's school in the summer of 1887. The school structure was simpler than Elva's original, 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, with 8 sash frames and a shallower excavation. It was designed for teaching and for emergency shelter, not for year-round production. While they worked on the school drain, Pater taught Elva one final lesson. He sat on the edge of the excavation with his legs hanging into the trench and said something she did not expect. Any design you intend for others must be simpler and safer than the one you built for yourself. Why? If the full design works, why not teach the full design? Because you will not be standing in their pit when the wall moves. You will not be there at 4 in the morning when the stove goes out and the temperature drops and they have to decide whether to vent or seal. You built your structure by living inside your mistakes. They cannot live inside your mistakes. They must live inside a structure that forgives the mistakes they have not made yet. It was the longest speech Pater had ever given her. She wrote it in the margin of a ledger page and underlined it twice. Late in the autumn of 1887, Pater worked several wet days on the school drainage extension. The October rains had exposed a weakness in the outlet. The stone box needed to be extended another 4 feet downslope to clear a clay layer that backed water during heavy storms. He dug the extension in cold rain, standing in water to his shins, and did not change his wet clothes until he returned to his wagon that evening. The cough started 3 days later. By the end of the week, it had settled deep in his chest, producing a sound like paper tearing each time he exhaled. Elva brought him to the sleeping chamber behind the greenhouse, where the earth-moderated temperature and the dry air were easier on his lungs than his canvas-topped wagon. He did not improve. The fever rose and held. His breathing grew shallow and rapid, and his face took on the gray translucence of skin, losing its argument with what lay beneath. Nell brought a doctor from Chadron. The doctor examined Pater, listened to his lungs, and told Elva what she already knew. The pneumonia had filled both sides, and there was nothing to do but keep him warm and still and hope that his body could fight what his years could not. Pater died on a Thursday morning in late November, 7 months after he had returned from Fort Robinson. The greenhouse thermometer read 54 degrees. Outside, the first snow of the season dusted the glass. He died having seen Elva become a teacher. He died having seen the school glass house take its first crop of spinach. He died in the chamber he had helped build, on the earth floor he had helped level, surrounded by the timber walls he had shown her how to brace. He left her the carpenter's square, which she already had. He left her a notebook half filled with construction notes, dimensions, timber grades, joint specifications, and sketches of braces and drainage details from 20 years of building. The pages after the notes were blank except for the last one, which carried a single line in Pater's careful hand. Write what failed. 3 words. The entire philosophy of the measurement board, the ledgers, the temperature records, the crossed-out dimensions and abandoned designs. Write what failed because the part that worked was built from the parts that did not. Elva placed the notebook beside the ledgers on the shelf. She placed the carpenter's square on top of it. She did not cry in front of Nell. She did not cry in the greenhouse. She stood beside the hatch that evening and watched the snow fall onto the straw mats and melt where the warmth rose through the glass. And she felt the absence of Peter Kvame the way she felt the absence of stored heat on a cloudy day, as a cold that the structure could survive, but the person inside it would carry for a long time. Winter closed over the settlement for the second time. Elva managed the greenhouse alone. The routines Peter had helped establish, morning vent, midday temperature check, evening mat cover, weekly drainage inspection, bi-weekly manure refresh, continued without variation because the structure did not know that the man who had helped build it was gone. The thermometer still read 44 at dawn. The stone wall still released its heat. The drainage still ran clear. She sold her first winter greens in Chadron in December, bundles of spinach, lettuce, and mustard tied with twine and sold at the hotel and to 4 households who paid in coin. The amounts were modest, $1.20 for the first week's harvest, $1.45 for the second dime, but they were cash, and cash in December was rarer than green leaves. She applied every cent to the mule note. By Christmas, she had reduced the debt to $19. The original principal was $32. Interest and partial payments had tangled the accounting, but the direction was clear. The note was shrinking, and the greenhouse was the reason. Voss accepted the payments without comment. He marked his ledger and returned the receipts and said nothing about holes or windows or graves. His silence was not concession. It was recalculation. January of 1888 arrived, and with it a crisis that Elva had not anticipated and could not have designed for. On January 12th, the morning broke warm and still across the northern plains. Children walked to school without heavy coats. Nell Acker opened the schoolhouse windows to let in the mild air. 11 children sat at their desks, ranging in age from 6 to 14, working through arithmetic and spelling exercises while the unseasonable warmth made the room feel like April. The front arrived without warning. The temperature dropped from above freezing to well below zero in less than an hour. Wind slammed into the schoolhouse from the northwest, hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames. Snow followed the wind in a wall so thick and fast that the light inside the classroom changed from afternoon sun to gray dusk in the space of 5 minutes. The children at the window desks stopped writing and stared. Nell knew what was happening. Everyone on the plains knew the shape of a January north air, the sudden warmth followed by the killing cold, the wind that turned snow into sand, the whiteout that could trap a person 10 feet from their own door. She had heard the stories of school teachers who led children into the storm and lost them. She had heard the stories of the ones who stayed. She barred the door and checked the stove. The woodbox held enough fuel for perhaps 4 hours. The schoolhouse walls were thin, single-board construction with minimal chinking, and the wind found every gap and seam. The temperature inside the room began to fall. Nell counted the children. 11. 3 were siblings from a homestead 2 miles north. 2 were children of the German family Falk. 1 was Owen, Nell's nephew, who had survived the January blizzard the previous year inside Elva's greenhouse, and who now sat very still at his desk with his hands flat on the wood, watching the windows turn white. One was Voss's daughter. Her name was Alma. She was 9 years old, and she sat in the back row with her arithmetic half finished and her eyes on the door. Elva heard the storm hit from inside the greenhouse. The sound was different from the previous January, sharper, faster, a compression of air and ice that struck the glass hard enough to make the sash frames ring. She sealed the vents, covered the mats, and checked the thermometer. Then she thought of the school. Nell had 11 children. The schoolhouse had thin walls and limited fuel. The school glass house, Pater's last project, the smaller structure built for teaching and emergency shelter, sat 20 feet from the schoolhouse door, its earth-banked walls buried to the glass line, its growing beds still warm from the morning sun. Elva tied a rope to the hatch post and walked into the storm. The distance from her claim to the school was slightly more than a mile. She could not see the ground. She could not see the sky. She held the rope for the first 100 yards, then followed the fence line that ran along the track, keeping one hand on the wire while the wind tried to push her sideways into the open prairie. The wire cut through her glove. She switched hands. The second glove tore. She kept the bare fingers on the wire and felt the cold enter her hand like water entering a boot. She reached the school by following the fence to its corner post and then counting steps across the yard. She had walked the distance in calm weather and knew it was 42 paces from the corner to the schoolhouse door. In the storm, with the wind pushing and the snow blinding, it took 61. She pounded on the barred door. Nell opened it. 11 faces looked at her from the dim room, lit only by the stove's glow and the gray light forcing through the snow-covered windows. "The school glass house," Elva said. "It is warmer than this room, and the walls are thicker, but it was not built for 12 people. We have to manage it." Nell did not argue. The stove wood was already half gone, and the temperature inside the schoolhouse had dropped 15 degrees in the hour since the storm began. They moved the children in pairs through the snow, 20 feet from the schoolhouse door to the glass house hatch, a distance that felt like 100 in the whiteout. The older children guided the younger ones. Owen led Alma Voss by the hand because she was shaking too hard to walk a straight line, and he knew from the previous winter what the inside of a pit greenhouse felt like when the world outside it was trying to kill you. The school glass house had not been designed as a residence. Its growing space was 12 feet by 6, 72 square feet for 13 people, but the earth-banked walls held the ground's moderated temperature. The 8-sash frames, covered with straw mats, retained what solar heat the structure had absorbed during the warm morning. The manure bed was small but active. Elva adapted the space the way she had adapted her own greenhouse during the previous storm, but faster now, because the lessons were already in her hands. She closed the growing chamber with a canvas tarp and pushed the children against the warm earth wall, where the ground temperature was highest. The older students cleared snow from the mats using poles pushed upward through the interior, the same method Elva had used the previous January, now performed by 4 pairs of hands instead of 1. A bucket placed under the lowest roof joint caught meltwater that dripped through the sash seams. Ventilation was open briefly every 30 minutes, a ritual Elva directed with a pocket watch to prevent the buildup of carbon dioxide and moisture from 13 people breathing in an enclosed space. The children sat against the earth wall in the warm dark. The youngest ones pressed together. The oldest ones helped manage the poles and the bucket and the vent schedule. Nell kept count of the children every 15 minutes, a number she reported to Elva each time, not because either of them had forgotten, but because saying the number out loud was a way of holding the world in place. 11. 11. 11. If this story reminds you why knowledge matters only when it is shared, send it to someone who believes preparation can save more than one household. The storm lasted into the following morning. The schoolhouse, when they checked it at dawn, had dropped below freezing inside. The stove wood was spent. The thin walls had surrendered to the wind hours before the front passed. If the children had stayed, they would have been burning desks and books by midnight, and the building might not have held them through the pre-dawn hours when the temperature outside dropped to its lowest point. Across the wider region, the storm killed approximately 235 people. Many were children caught between school and home. Many were adults who stepped outside to tend livestock and could not find their way back. The Shadron area was spared the worst of the death toll, but the stories arrived with the mail and the freight wagons in the weeks that followed, and each story carried the same shape. Someone who was warm became cold because the distance between shelter and danger was shorter than they believed. In the school glass house, nobody died. Nobody lost fingers or toes. The 11 children and 2 adults spent the night against an earth wall that held 48 degrees, while the air above the snow held something near 20 below. It was not comfortable. It was not warm enough to sleep well. But it was enough, and enough was the entire point. Voss did not come to the school during the storm. He could not have. The whiteout made travel impossible, and his store was on the far side of Shadron from the schoolhouse. He did not know that Alma was in the glass house until the following afternoon, when Nell brought the children back to town, and Alma ran to him across the frozen street with her arithmetic paper still clutched in one hand. He held his daughter and said nothing. He stood in the street with his arms around her and his face turned away from the people who were watching, and whatever passed through him in that moment, he did not share it. 3 days later, a wagon arrived at the school carrying 12 sound sash frames, a keg of nails, and 4 lengths of milled pine. The driver said the delivery was paid for. He did not say by whom. The bill of sale, which Nell found folded inside the nail keg, bore the stamp of Voss's store. Voss had not converted. He had not admitted error. He had not spoken to Elva or acknowledged the greenhouse or withdrawn his claim against the mule note. He had sent glass. The glass said what he could not. By the end of January 1888, the settlement's relationship to Elva Mercer's work had shifted in a way that could be measured not in opinions but in activity. Bellamy built a small stone-backed cold frame against the south wall of his mill shed, not a full-pit greenhouse, but a structure that used the same principles of thermal mass and south-facing glazing. 2 families installed straw covers over existing surface frames, extending their growing season by several weeks in each direction. The school received seedlings from Elva's greenhouse for early spring planting, and Nell began teaching the older children to read soil temperatures and keep weather records on the same slate where they practiced arithmetic. Elva's early lettuce and radishes sold in Shadron through March. The earnings were modest but steady, enough to continue reducing the mule note and to purchase replacement glass, putty, and seed for the coming season. More important, 3 families paid deposits for spring transplants, cabbage starts, onion sets, and early tomato plants that Elva germinated in the hotbed and hardened in the cooler zone before the ground thawed. The deposits provided cash before the growing season began, bridging the gap between winter expenses and spring income that had nearly destroyed her the previous year. She was no longer the woman digging a grave in the hillside. She was the woman whose grave had kept people alive. The distinction was not one she would have chosen, but it was the one the settlement had given her, and she carried it the way she carried the carpenter's square eye, as a tool that belonged to someone else first, and had become hers through use. But the mule note still stood. Voss still held it. And the question that had followed the project from its first day, whether Elva could turn survival into something durable enough to outlast the men who wanted her to fail, remained open, its answer visible only to someone willing to read it in the rows of green, growing beneath the snow. Chunk 4 continues. Spring of 1888 broke the snow in stages. A week of melt followed by a week of freeze, the ground softening and hardening in alternation like a fist opening and closing. Elva used the greenhouse to start transplants earlier than any surface gardener in the district could manage. Cabbage and onion sets germinated in the hotbed in February. By March, they stood 3 inches tall in the cool zone, hardening against the temperature swings that would greet them when the ground finally accepted them. Early tomato plants started from seed she had saved the previous autumn, filled a shelf along the north wall, their stems pale and reaching toward the reflected light from the whitewashed board above. She sold the transplants in chadron at prices that reflected their timing rather than their size. A cabbage start in late March was worth 3 times what it would cost in May, because 3 weeks of growing season on the northern plains was the difference between a harvest and a gamble. 4 families bought full flats. The hotel purchased onion sets in bulk. A rancher's wife rode 12 miles to buy tomato starts and asked Elva to explain the hotbed method so she could attempt it herself the following winter. Elva explained it. She drew a diagram on the back of a receipt and wrote the manure-to-straw ratio and the wrist temperature test and the warning about overheating. She did not charge for the information. She charged for the plants. The distinction mattered to her in a way she did not fully articulate until Nell asked her about it later that spring. "The plants are my work," Elva said. "The method is not mine. My mother showed me the hotbed. Pater showed me the bracing. The earth showed me the temperature. I cannot sell what I did not make." It was not modesty. It was accuracy. And Elva had learned from her measurement boards that accuracy was the only currency that held its value through every season. The mule note stood at $11 by April. Elva paid $2 from the transplant sales and another $1.50 from the winter greens. Voss accepted the payments and entered them in his ledger with the same neutral hand he used for every transaction. He did not mention the storm. He did not mention the school. He did not mention the 12 sash frames he had sent anonymously, though by now most of the settlement had guessed their origin. The public meeting happened in May. Bellamy had proposed that the settlement contribute labor and materials toward a larger community winter structure. Not a greenhouse for one household, but an earth-sheltered room that could serve as emergency shelter and shared growing space during the worst months. The idea had grown from the children's blizzard. 235 deaths across the region had convinced even the skeptics that thin-walled buildings and scattered homesteads were not sufficient protection against the storms the plains produced. The meeting took place at the store. 14 adults attended. Bellamy presented the proposal. Nell described the school glass house and its performance during the storm. Elva brought her temperature ledgers and offered to help site the structure. A homesteader named Drucker objected. He was new to the district, had not been present during either blizzard, and had heard the stories secondhand. "This is another Mercer grave," Drucker said. "You want us to dig a hole and put our families in it. What happens when the walls collapse? What happens when the drainage fails? You're asking people to trust their children to a pit." The room went quiet. Elva opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, Voss stood up. He had been sitting in the back row, behind the counter of his own store, with his arms crossed and his ledger closed on the shelf beside him. He stood slowly, the way a man stands when he has been sitting with something heavy for a long time and has finally decided to set it down. "I waited 2 winters for that grave to close over her," Voss said. His voice was flat and even. Instead, it kept pulling people out of the cold. He looked at Drucker. He looked at the room. He did not look at Elva. "My daughter was in the school pit during the January storm. 11 children and 2 women spent the night against an earth wall while the schoolhouse froze solid around an empty stove. If the pit had not been there, I would be talking about my daughter the way the families in Dakota talk about theirs. I am not. He sat down. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then Bellamy asked for a vote, and the proposal carried without further objection. After the meeting, Voss found Elva outside the store. The street was muddy with spring melt, and the late afternoon light gave the store fronts a warmth they did not possess in winter. He produced the mule note from his coat pocket. He tore off the portion representing accumulated interest, roughly $9 of charges that had compounded since the original loan. He handed the remainder to Elva. The principal is $7.50, he said. Pay it when you can. The interest is gone. Elva took the paper. She studied it, the familiar handwriting, the dates of partial payments, the column of interest charges that had grown like a vine around the original debt. She folded it and put it in her coat. I will pay the principal in full by July. I know you will. She could have thanked him. She could have accepted the gesture as the apology it partly was. Instead, she said something that had been sitting inside her since the day he stood at the edge of her excavation and told her he would own the hill by spring. You thought empty land was worth more than anything I could grow on it. Voss met her eyes. Whatever he saw there, competence, anger, the residue of 2 years of pressure and doubt. He did not flinch from it. I did, he said. The land was never empty. I was wrong about what was already there. The line carried more weight than he intended. The land had not been empty before Amos Mercer filed his claim, and it had not been empty before the settlers arrived. The Oglala Lakota had known that country, its springs, its slopes, its sheltered places, for generations before the government drew lines across it and called it available. Voss meant that Elva's work had value he had failed to see, but the words reached further than his meaning, and Elva heard both the personal truth and the larger one, and she let them stand together without correcting either. She paid the principal in June, 3 weeks ahead of the deadline. The mule was hers. The claim was hers. The hill and the spring and the south-facing slope and every row of green growing beneath the glass belonged to her and to no one else. Jonas Wren arrived in August of 1888. He was 29, a railroad sash carpenter and glazier who had heard about the sunken glass house from a freight driver passing through the Fort Robinson depot. He had built windows for railroad stations and freight offices across the Western line, and he considered himself knowledgeable about glass, weather, and the behavior of sash under stress. He expected to find a novelty, a crude structure held together by desperation and scavenged materials. He expected to offer his professional services, direct the necessary repairs, and leave with a story about a woman who had stumbled onto something interesting but did not fully understand the craft of what she had built. He found Elva on the roof. She was replacing a sash frame that had cracked during a spring hailstorm. She had removed the old frame, cleaned the rabbet with a chisel, applied fresh putty and an even bead, and was setting the new pane. See, a piece she had cut from a larger salvage sheet using a glass cutter she had purchased in Chadron with transplant money. The cut was clean, straight, and scored at the correct depth. The putty was even. The pane seated into the frame without rocking or gapping. Jonas watched from the ground for several minutes before announcing himself. When he climbed down the hatch and examined the interior, he found work that was not elegant but was sound. The joints were tight. The bracing was overbuilt in places, more timber than strictly necessary at each junction, which meant the builder had understood that failure in one joint could cascade through the frame and bring down an entire bay. The drainage system was more elaborate than anything he had seen on a structure this size, and the inspection opening in the north wall, a maintenance access that most builders would not have considered, showed a level of operational thinking that separated this building from the hundreds of sheds, barns, and shanties he had worked on across the railroad line. He proposed replacing the storm-damaged south side framing with a heavier header beam that would span the full width of the greenhouse and distribute snow load more evenly across the rafters. It was sound carpentry. It would make the roof stronger. It had one flaw. The header he described would sit 3 inches lower than the existing frame, and those 3 inches would block the winter's sun during the critical morning hours when the glazing angle needed every degree of pitch to capture the low December light. 3 inches of shadow across the growing beds for 2 hours each morning, compounded across 90 days of winter, would reduce the solar gain that kept the stone wall warm and the root beds above freezing. Elva told him no. She explained why. She showed him the sun tracking data from her ledgers, the angle measurements, the shadow lines, the correlation between morning light and afternoon stone wall temperature. Jonas measured her alternative, a shallower header with angled braces transferring the load to the uprights rather than spanning the full opening, and calculated the load path. The physics held. The brace angles were correct. The sun would reach the beds without obstruction, and the roof would carry the snow. He conceded the point. It cost him something. He had built sash for railroad buildings where daylight was a convenience, not a survival requirement. Elva had built for a structure where every hour of sun translated directly into degrees of warmth that kept plants and people alive. The design constraint was different from anything in his experience, and she had understood it because she had lived inside the constraint for 2 winters while he had studied wood and glass from the outside. "Your framing is not what I would build," Jonas told her on the third day, "but it is built for this place. Mine was built for a different one." Their courtship, if it could be called that, developed through disagreement and shared labor rather than through the conventional rituals of the settlement. Jonas returned in October to help prepare the greenhouse for winter. He returned again in December to replace a cracked pane and reinforce the hatch hinges. Each visit lasted longer than the one before. They argued about putty composition. Jonas preferred a harder mix, more whiting, less oil, that cured to a rigid seal and lasted years without maintenance. Elva preferred a softer mix that she could rework in cold weather with her thumb without cracking the glass beneath it. The harder mix was better carpentry. The softer mix was better operations. They compromised on a medium formula that neither loved and both could live with. They argued about whether the upper vents should open outward or inward. Outward vents shed rain but caught wind. Inward vents avoided wind but dripped condensation onto the growing beds. The argument lasted 2 full days, during which they built one of each, tested them in a rainstorm, and agreed on a design that pivoted on a center pin and could be angled either direction depending on conditions. The solution was more complex than either original proposal and worked better than both. They argued about the best angle for the winter glazing. Jonas believed 40 degrees was sufficient. Elva insisted on 45, based on her sun tracking data and 2 years of temperature records. They calculated the difference in solar gain, and Elva won by 3 degrees of afternoon stonewall temperature, a margin that Jonas admitted was significant enough to justify the steeper pitch and the additional framing it required. Nell observed the process with the dry amusement of a woman who had watched Elva argue with Bellamy, Voss, Peter, the clay, the weather, and the mule, and who recognized that Elva's form of affection was indistinguishable from her form of professional criticism. "You know you like him," Nell told her one afternoon while they stitched replacement straw mats in the sleeping chamber. "I know his glazing is better than mine," Elva said, which was as close to a declaration as Nell was going to get. They married in the spring of 1890. The ceremony was small. Nell, Bellamy, Owen, and a handful of neighbors stood in the May sunlight beside the original greenhouse while the school teacher read the vows. Before the wedding, Jonas signed an agreement recognizing Elva's claim and greenhouse business as her separate property. The The agreement was unusual for the period and raised eyebrows among the neighbors who heard about it. Elva insisted on it, and Jonas signed without argument because he understood that the claim was not a piece of land. It was the thing she had built when every authority in the district told her she could not, and asking her to surrender title to it would be the same as asking her to forget why she had survived. By the early 1890s, their operation had grown into three linked earth-sheltered houses, totaling roughly 900 square feet of growing space. The original pit remained the centerpiece, its stone wall darkened by years of absorbed sunlight, its timber bracing replaced in sections as the wood aged, its drainage trench cleaned and relined every autumn like a ritual that kept the structure breathing. A second house built into the adjacent slope held the seedling operation, hotbeds, germination flats, and hardening shelves arranged in temperature zones that moved the plants from warm to cool as they matured. A third structure, smaller and lower, served as earth-banked root storage and cool-season growing space for the hardiest crops. They produced winter greens for the Shadron Hotel and a growing list of households: spinach, lettuce, mustard, cress, and scallions bundled in twine and delivered weekly through the coldest months. Early cabbage and onion plants went to homesteaders across the district in flats that Jonas built to standard dimensions so they stacked in a wagon without shifting. Spring tomato transplants, started in the hotbed in February, hardened in the cool zone through March, sold in April, so became the steadiest income. Medicinal and kitchen herbs filled a section near the warm wall: parsley, sage, thyme, and a small stand of chamomile that Nell used for the school's winter ailments. Seed stock selected over successive seasons for cool house performance, accumulated in labeled envelopes that Elva stored in a tin box on the shelf beside the ledgers. Elva and Jonas had two children, a daughter and a son born in the early 90s. The domestic years compressed into the rhythms of the greenhouse, mornings measuring temperatures before breakfast, evenings covering the glass before supper, winters tending the manure bed and the root crops while the children slept in the earth-banked chamber that stayed warmer than any cabin on the prairie. The children learned to read thermometers before they learned to read books. They kept their own temperature ledgers in pencil, mimicking their mother's careful columns of numbers. They were forbidden from calling the structure foolproof because their mother had lived through the nights when the temperature dropped to 37 degrees, and the margin between alive and frozen was thinner than the glass above their heads. 14 smaller structures appeared within roughly 25 miles of Chadron in the years that followed. Not all were replicas. Some were shallow, cold frames with earth-banked walls, simpler versions that Bellamy championed for families without the slope or the labor to dig a full pit. Some were complete pit greenhouses modeled on Elva's measurements, sited on south-facing hillsides with demonstrated drainage. Some were hybrid structures that combined her principles with local variations in soil, slope, and available glass. A family named Falk built a sturdy version into a sandy ridge east of town that produced winter radishes and turnips for 3 years before the sand shifted and the north wall required rebuilding. One family built their pit into a creek bank against Elva's explicit warning and lost it to spring flooding, the exact failure she had predicted, the exact reason she refused to endorse sites without tested drainage outlets. She taught each builder individually. She walked their slopes with sharpened sticks and marked the sun's path the way she had marked her own. She tested their soil with the mattock and judged whether it would hold a wall or surrender to water. She measured their exposure and calculated their glazing angles. She told them what would work and what would not, and when families asked why she would not simply sell them a plan and let them build at their own risk, she repeated what Pater had told her. Any design intended for others must be simpler and safer than your own, because you will not be standing in their pit when the wall moves. Nell's school used its smaller glass house for winter lessons and emergency shelter for the remainder of the decade. Each autumn, the older children carried straw mats over the school glass and weighted them with stones, while the younger ones raked leaves along the earth-banked walls for additional insulation. Each morning through the winter, a student on rotation checked the soil thermometer and wrote the number on a slate hung beside the classroom door. The numbers accumulated across the years, a record of the Earth's constancy that the children studied alongside arithmetic and spelling and carried with them when they grew up and left for homesteads of their own. Elva never claimed to have invented glass houses, hotbeds, or earth sheltering. She knew that glass-covered growing structures had existed for decades in commercial gardens and wealthy estates, that manure-heated beds were standard practice among market gardeners, and that people had built into the ground since before recorded memory. Her achievement was not invention. It was combination under constraint, joining known principles with limited materials on a specific piece of ground when the alternative was starvation, and proving through 2 winters of careful measurement that the combination held. Anyone with enough glass and enough money could build a heated greenhouse. Elva had done it with $19, a borrowed mule, and the memory of her mother's hand lifting a sash to show her green leaves in October. She kept the ledgers. That was the part that lasted longer than the glass, or the timber, or the stone. Air temperatures at dawn, noon, and dusk. Root bed temperatures, sowing dates, germination times, harvest weights, crop failures, which varieties bolted in warm spells, which froze at the margins during cloud cover, which succumbed to mold in humid weather, which produced reliably year after year without complaint, broken panes and their causes, replaced putty and its composition, drainage inspections and their findings, the names of families who copied the design and the modifications they made and the results they reported back. The ledgers filled a shelf in the original earth chamber, their spines darkened by the same humidity that kept the growing beds alive. They recorded not just what worked, but what failed, the test pit that flooded, the manure bed that overheated, the 4 days of cloud that dropped the temperature to 39 degrees, the cracked pane and the frozen outlet, and the night the stove went out, and 3 people breathed against the earth wall, while January tried to enter through every seam. Write what failed. Pater's instruction lived in every crossed-out entry, every corrected measurement, every margin note that said tried again with less straw or drain cleared of ice after 6 days of freeze. The final scene belongs not to the operation or the settlement or the spread of the design, but to a morning near the end of things. Elva was an older woman. Her hands were stiff in the way that decades of labor make hands stiff, the knuckles swollen, the grip slower, but still certain. She moved through the original greenhouse the way she had always moved through it. Thermometer first, then drainage outlet, then glass, then beds. The routine had not changed. The structure still talked to her in the language Pater had taught her to hear. The timber still ticked when the soil shifted. The condensation still formed its patterns on the glass, and she still read them the way other people read clouds. A young teacher, one of Nell's successors at the school, visited the greenhouse that spring and spent an hour examining Pater's notebook. She turned the pages slowly, past the construction notes and the joint specifications and the drainage sketches, until she reached the section of crossed-out dimensions and abandoned designs that filled the middle of the book. "Why did he keep all of this?" the teacher asked. "The wrong measurements, the failed designs. Why not just keep the ones that worked?" Elva placed the carpenter's square beside the open notebook. The square's brass edge was worn smooth from 30 years of use, and the wood had darkened to the color of old honey. Because the part that worked was built from the parts that did not, Elva said. On a clear morning after the first heavy snow of a late season, Elva walked to the original greenhouse and removed one straw mat from the south-facing glass. She did it herself, the way she had done it every clear morning for years beyond counting, pulling the heavy mat back slowly, letting the winter light enter in a widening stripe that crossed the growing beds and warmed the stone wall and filled the chamber with the smell of damp earth and living green. She stood in the light for a moment. The thermometer on the wall read 56 degrees. Outside, the snow lay smooth and brilliant under a sky so blue it looked like water. The glass was cold on its outer face and warm on its inner face, and between those two surfaces, condensation ran in thin streams that caught the morning sun and shone like threads of silver laid against the dark. She left the mat folded on the rim and climbed down into the beds to check the soil. 14 households, one school, 3 linked greenhouses on a hillside that a freight driver had once approached carrying a dead man's watch and glove. The drawing stayed free. Jonas sold standardized sash and framing work to the families who built their own versions, but no one was ever charged for the measurements, the angles, the depths, the drainage grades, the temperature ranges that Elva had recorded year after year until the numbers held. Elva lived out her later years on the claim her father never completed. The cabin Amos started, the one with the unfinished north wall and the tarred paper and the canvas door, had been replaced long ago by a proper house that Jonas built on the flat ground below the slope. But the original earth chamber remained, its walls still holding the ground's moderated temperature, its shelf still carrying the ledgers and the carpenter's square and the notebook with its final instruction. The row of weather records filling that shelf was her monument, not the greenhouse, not the crops, not the families who had copied and adapted and passed the knowledge forward. The numbers were the work. The books held the numbers. The shelf held the books, and the earth held the shelf steady through every season. The checking party rode toward the claim on a January morning in 1887. They had seen no smoke. They expected a body. Above ground, the cabin window was white with frost. The old woodpile leaned against the east wall, barely diminished. Snow buried the track and the fences and the garden plot that had failed 3 times in a single summer. Bellamy stood where he had once delivered his verdict to a 21-year-old woman with $19 and a mule she did not own. A hole with windows is still a hole. January will fill it with ice, and you with dirt. Years later, the same man watched school children descend through a hatch into Nell's winter garden. One child pushed aside a canvas curtain. Another knelt beside a green row and cut spinach with a small knife while snow rasped across the glass overhead. The hillside had filled with earth, but the earth surrounded the structure instead of burying it. Ice covered the prairie, but it stopped beyond the insulated hatch where warm air rose from below and dissolved into the frozen sky. Condensation ran down the inside of an old sash while frost spread across its outer surface. A child's hand reached between the two, between the warmth and the cold, between the growing season and the killing season, between what the settlement expected and what one woman proved, and lifted a green leaf from the dark soil. Above them, January still held the plains. Below it, the rose stayed green,